The first Black Hawk went down at 1542. No warning. No build-up. Just a sudden break in the sky over Mogadishu. The sharp rotation of a UH-60 tail section sheared by an RPG-7, and then gravity taking over where control had failed. Super 61 hit the ground nose first, less than 4 kilometers from the target building. Dust rose before the sound arrived. Inside the city, the temperature hovered near 32 degrees Celsius. Heat clung to the narrow streets, trapped between concrete walls and corrugated metal roofs. Visibility dropped instantly. Radios began to overlap. Super 61 is down. Super 61 is down. There was no confusion in the voice. Only compression. The kind that comes when the plan collapses faster than language can adjust. Above the crash site, orbiting MH-6 little birds broke formation. The AH-6 gunships pivoted, miniguns spooling up, firing into alleyways they had scanned only minutes before. What had been a surveillance pattern became a containment attempt. On the ground, operators from 1st SFODD, Delta Force, were already moving. They had fast-roped into the objective minutes earlier. The target building had been secured. 2 lieutenants linked to Mohammed Farah Aidid were in custody. Rangers from the 75th Ranger Regiment had established outer security, blocking intersections, controlling movement. It was supposed to take 30 minutes. They were still within the first 10. Then the second call came. Super 64 is hit. A pause. Not disbelief. Recognition. Another RPG. Another helicopter losing altitude. Another uncontrolled descent into a city that had just learned how to fight back. This one didn't crash immediately. It tried to hold. It drifted. Then it dropped, further south, deeper into the grid. 2 aircraft. 2 crash sites. Hundreds of armed militia already converging. The mission had changed, but the chain of command had not caught up yet. At the Tactical Operations Center near the airfield, officers from Task Force Ranger were still processing the first impact when the second report came through. Requests began to stack. QRF deployment. Armored convoy rerouting. Close air support coordination. Approval did not move at the same speed as collapse. On the streets, the geometry of control was already gone. Ranger chalks that had been inserted for perimeter security were now isolated in fragments, separated by blocks filled with civilians, fighters, and shifting allegiances. Convoy routes that had been mapped in clean lines now intersected. With burning tires and improvised barricades. The city was no longer terrain. It was behavior. Delta operators moved toward the first crash site on foot, cutting through alleys, navigating by instinct and partial radio updates. They were not advancing toward an objective anymore. They were moving into a gravity well. Because the assumption had been simple. Overwhelming force. Rapid insertion. Short duration. Control the target. Extract before resistance forms. They had everything. Satellite imagery. Signals intelligence. ISR coverage from P-3 Orion aircraft overhead. Helicopter dominance. Night-capable optics. Highly trained units with years of operational experience. They had rehearsed the assault down to minutes. But none of those timelines included what was already happening. Because the militia did not need coordination in the way Task Force Ranger understood it. They only needed a signal. And the signal had already been sent. They had planned for resistance. They had not planned for convergence. Within minutes of Super 61 going down, the radio net began to fracture under volume. Ranger elements were still holding their assigned blocking positions along National Street. But the geometry no longer made sense. Intersections they were supposed to dominate were now feeding bodies toward the crash site. Not in formation, not in units, but in waves. Men with AK-47s. Others with old Soviet RPK light machine guns. Some carried nothing but radios and ran messages on foot, cutting through alleys too narrow for vehicles. Women and children moved alongside them, not as shields, but as part of the environment, fluid, unpredictable, impossible to classify. Task Force Ranger had expected delay. What they encountered was acceleration. Inside the first perimeter, Delta operators reached the wreckage of Super 61. The fuselage had fractured on impact. The tail section lay twisted 30 meters away. One crew member was already dead. Others were trapped inside, partially conscious, pinned by collapsed metal and wiring. The crash site was not defensible. It sat at a junction of narrow streets, surrounded by multi-story buildings with open windows and unfinished rooftops. Every elevation was a firing position. Every shadow held movement. Delta teams began immediate triage, cutting through the airframe with whatever tools they had. No heavy extraction equipment. No secured perimeter. Just time, collapsing inward. Rangers were rerouted to reinforce. But rerouting required vehicles. And vehicles required roads. The convoy from the 10th Mountain Division, Humvees and 5-ton trucks, had already begun moving from the base near the airport. Their task was simple in theory. Push through the city, reach the crash site, extract personnel. In practice, they were driving into a system that had already adapted. Roadblocks appeared faster than they could be cleared. Burning tires. Scrap metal. Civilian vehicles positioned at angles that forced convoys to slow, to stop, to expose themselves. Every halt became a target. Every turn became a decision point with incomplete information. The lead vehicles carried M2.50 caliber machine guns and Mk-19 grenade launchers. Firepower was not the issue. Visibility was. Militia fighters did not hold ground. They touched it. They fired from corners, from behind walls, from inside crowds, then disappeared. The convoy gunners engaged constantly, but the targets dissolved faster than they could be confirmed. A firefight without a front. Back at the Tactical Operations Center, Command tried to impose structure. JSOC officers coordinated with elements of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Requests for continuous aerial overwatch were approved. Little birds rotated in cycles, providing suppressive fire where they could identify concentrations. But identification required clarity, and the city did not offer it. Signals intelligence from Task Force Orange had mapped networks, call patterns, known associates. It had built a picture of influence, of hierarchy. But on the ground, hierarchy had collapsed into participation. No single command node to disrupt. No central control to decapitate. Just momentum. The second crash site, Super 64, was worse. It had gone down deeper into hostile territory, nearly a kilometer beyond the first site. 2 Delta snipers, inserted by MH6 under extreme risk, requested permission to be deployed directly to the crash. The request moved up the chain. From ground command to air command. From air command to JSOC liaison. Each step measured, procedural, necessary. TUM did not wait for it. They were eventually inserted. 2 men against a city. On the ground, Ranger chalks assigned to perimeter security were now fixed in place. Some had taken casualties. 1 unit, cut off near an intersection, attempted to move toward the first crash site on foot. They advanced 1 block, then stopped. Fire came from 3 directions. Not coordinated, but overlapping. Enough to pin them in place. Enough to break movement into hesitation. And hesitation, in that environment, spread. The convoy never reached Super 61 on its first attempt. Navigation errors compounded under stress. Streets that looked identical. Landmarks obscured by smoke. Drivers relying on outdated maps and fragmented radio instructions. At one point, the convoy circled within 2 blocks of the objective without recognizing it. Fuel burned. Ammunition was expended. Time stretched. The plan had assumed 30 minutes on target. By the end of the first hour, they had not even established extraction. By the second, the mission had inverted. It was no longer about capturing lieutenants. It was about not losing everyone already committed. And still, the assumption held. That more force would restore control. Additional Rangers were inserted. More aircraft were tasked. The system responded the only way it knew how, by scaling. But scale requires coherence. And Mogadishu was no longer coherent. It absorbed pressure and redistributed it. Every increase in force density created more contact points, more engagements, more fragmentation of attention. The operators on the ground felt it before command acknowledged it. Because they were no longer executing a mission, they were surviving a pattern they did not design. They had rehearsed speed. They encountered duration. They had prepared for resistance. They triggered participation. And somewhere between those 2 realities, control slipped. Not suddenly, but completely. The system kept asking the wrong question. Why are we not reaching the crash site? It sounded operational. It felt urgent. It was also irrelevant. Because the failure was not in movement. It was in understanding. Task Force Ranger had built its entire approach on a model that had worked before. Precision raids. Rapid insertion. Overwhelming localized force. Extract before the environment reacts. It had worked in Panama. It had worked in parts of Iraq. It had worked in controlled urban environments where resistance followed structure. Mogadishu did not follow structure. And yet, Every layer of the operation continued to behave as if it did. Signals intelligence from Task Force Orange had identified key figures within Aidid's network. Couriers, lieutenants, meeting locations, patterns of communication. The raid itself was based on that intelligence. It was accurate, in a narrow sense. The targets were exactly where they were supposed to be. But the intelligence had described a network. What they encountered was a population. The assumption had been reinforced repeatedly in the days leading up to the mission. Previous raids had succeeded. Helicopters inserted Ranger chocks with precision. Delta operators breached, secured, extracted. Somali militia response had been delayed, fragmented, manageable. Each success confirmed the model. Each success narrowed their interpretation of risk. They began to believe that speed was dominance. That if they moved fast enough, the city would never have time to react. But Mogadishu was not reacting. It was already configured. The militia did not need orders in the conventional sense. There was no centralized command issuing real-time directives that could be intercepted or disrupted. No radio frequency that, if jammed, would collapse coordination. Instead, there was something older. Distributed awareness. When the first Black Hawk went down, the information did not travel through a hierarchy. It spread laterally. Through runners. Through shouted messages. Through mosques. Through civilians who had seen enough of these operations to recognize what a falling helicopter meant. It meant opportunity. And opportunity did not require permission. Task Force Rangers' intelligence apparatus could map relationships, but it could not measure intent at scale. It could identify who mattered inside Aidid's structure, but it could not quantify how many would act when the moment came. So they miscalculated the threshold. They believed resistance would build over time. In reality, it arrived instantly. The problem was not that the militia was stronger than expected. The problem was that it was everywhere. And everywhere does not behave like an enemy force. It behaves like terrain. This is where the model began to fail in ways that were not immediately visible. Because the chain of command still functioned. Decisions were still being made. Requests still moved from ground units to the Tactical Operations Center, from there to higher coordination elements, then back down as approvals or denials. The structure remained intact, but the environment no longer matched the structure. A request for armored support had to move through U.S. command channels, then coordinate with UN forces, including Pakistani M48 tanks and Malaysian Condor armored personnel carriers. Each step required verification, alignment, authorization. Time accumulated at every layer. On the ground, time was being consumed differently. A Ranger squad pinned behind a wall did not measure time in minutes. They measured it in magazines, in water levels, in the angle of the sun dropping behind buildings, changing shadows, changing visibility. Delta operators at the crash site did not think in operational phases. They thought in seconds between bursts of incoming fire. In how long a wounded crew chief could remain conscious before blood loss made decisions irrelevant. Two systems were running simultaneously. One procedural, one immediate. They were not synchronized. Even the air advantage, considered decisive, began to reveal its limits. The MH-6 Little Birds and AH-6 gunships could engage visible targets. They could suppress movement in open streets. But Mogadishu did not offer open streets for long. Fighters adapted quickly, moving through interiors, breaking line of sight, using civilians as cover not by design, but by proximity. The pilots could not distinguish intent from altitude. And without clear identification, firepower became restraint. The second crash site exposed the failure completely. When Super 64 went down, the decision to insert two Delta snipers, Gordon and Sugart, was made under pressure. They understood the situation before the system did. They knew the crash site would be overrun. They also knew that no conventional reinforcement would arrive in time. Their request was not part of the original plan. It did not fit the structure. It was approved anyway, not because the system had adapted, but because, at that point, there was nothing else left that could reach the site. Two men were inserted into a space that the model could not explain. That alone should have clarified the problem. But it didn't, because the dominant assumption still held. That control could be reasserted. That if enough force was applied, if enough units were redirected, if enough coordination was achieved, the situation would stabilize. They had everything. Air superiority, highly trained units, firepower, intelligence. They still couldn't control the city, because control had never been available in the form they understood. The problem was not the militia's capability. The problem was the system's expectation. They were not fighting an enemy force. They were operating inside an environment that did not recognize their version of order. And by the time that became clear, the mission had already transformed into something else. Not a raid, not a capture operation, but a test of whether a structured military system could adapt fast enough when the rules it depended on stopped existing. It couldn't. Not in time. What they needed was not more force. It was a different way of seeing. But institutional systems do not pivot easily under pressure. They reinforce what they already trust. And Task Force Ranger trusted speed, precision, and centralized control. There was no framework inside that system for something slower, something quieter, something that did not begin with helicopters. Long before October 3rd, there had been other ways of operating inside environments like Mogadishu. Not American, not fast, not visible. British doctrine had faced similar conditions in Northern Ireland. Israeli units had adapted to dense civilian environments in Beirut and the West Bank. They had learned, over time, that visibility creates resistance faster than it creates control. So they reduced visibility. Units like the SAS did not rely on rapid insertion to dominate urban terrain. They dissolved into it. Small teams, civilian patterns, weeks of observation before a single movement. Not because they lacked capability, but because they understood the cost of being seen too early. Israeli Sayeret Matkal operated under a similar principle. Human intelligence first. Always. Not signals. Not imagery. People. Networks built slowly, often through intermediaries who never knew who they were actually supporting. They did not enter a neighborhood as a force. They entered as a presence. Unnoticed, or at least unconfirmed. That difference mattered, because Mogadishu was not opaque. It was transparent in the wrong direction. The population could see everything. Helicopters staging at the airfield. Convoys moving along predictable routes. Patterns forming over repeated raids. Every operation left a trace, and those traces accumulated into expectation. The militia did not need sophisticated intelligence systems. They needed memory. And they had it. Task Force Ranger operated on a 72-hour cycle of intelligence validation. Target identified. Pattern confirmed. Operation launched. But in those 72 hours, the city was already adjusting. Observers watched the airfield. Informants tracked movement. The moment helicopters lifted, word began to spread. Not formally, not through command channels, through familiarity. So when the Rangers fast-roped into the target building, they were not initiating contact. They were confirming it. This is where the doctrinal gap became critical, because the American model assumed that control begins at insertion, that once boots hit the ground, the operation defines the environment. But in Mogadishu, the environment had already defined the operation before it started. A different doctrine would have approached the same objective without announcing itself. No helicopter insertion, no visible staging, no 30-minute timeline. Instead, a slow build. Small reconnaissance elements inserted days in advance, possibly through CIA Special Activities Division assets already operating in the region. Not in uniform, not carrying signatures that could be traced back immediately. They would not secure the target building. They would study it. Who enters? Who leaves? At what time? Through which door? Who speaks to whom in the surrounding streets? Which rooftops are occupied at night? Which alleys remain empty? Patterns, not positions. Because patterns reveal stability. And stability reveals where pressure can be applied without triggering collapse. In that model, the capture of Aidid's lieutenants would not have required a daytime raid. It might not have required a raid at all. Interception during movement. Isolation away from dense population. Removal without spectacle. No signal. No convergence. No citywide reaction. But that approach requires something Task Force Ranger was not configured to provide in that moment. Time. Time without visible action. Time without measurable progress. Time that cannot be briefed in clean operational updates. And time that does not align with political pressure. Because the chain of command extended beyond the battlefield. Decisions did not end at the Tactical Operations Center. They moved through U.S. Central Command, through Department of Defense oversight, through a strategic environment that demanded results, not patience. Each successful raid reinforced that demand. Each captured target became proof that the system worked. So the system continued. Faster, more confident, less aware. By the time the operation on October 3rd was approved, the pattern was already set. Insert, capture, extract, repeat. No one inside that chain questioned whether the pattern itself was creating the conditions for failure, because it had not failed yet. And when systems succeed repeatedly, they stop examining their assumptions. They refine execution. They do not reconsider structure. So when the helicopters lifted that afternoon, carrying Delta Force operators and Ranger Chalks into the city, they were not just executing a mission. They were expressing a doctrine built on speed, visibility, and control. A doctrine that worked until it didn't. And when it broke, it did not break gradually. It broke all at once. Because the alternative had always been there. Slower, less visible, harder to measure. But it required admitting something the system was not designed to accept. That dominance does not come from how fast you move. It comes from whether the environment ever realizes you were there at all. The first perimeter collapsed quietly. Not in a single moment. Not with a clear signal. Just a gradual thinning of control around the crash site of Super 61, as ammunition dropped, as fields of fire narrowed, as every direction began to look the same. Delta operators had established a defensive pocket around the wreckage. Rangers reinforced where they could, shifting positions from blocked intersections, moving in short bursts between walls, dragging casualties when movement allowed it. Distance was measured in meters. Progress was measured in survival. The heat had not dropped. The air still held the weight of the afternoon, now mixed with smoke from burning debris and cordite from sustained gunfire. Hydration packs ran low. Some had already switched to rationing without saying it. No one expected to be there this long. Above them, H-6 little birds made repeated gun runs, their 7.62mm miniguns cutting arcs across rooftops where movement was detected. The pilots adjusted constantly, banking hard between buildings, avoiding small arms fire that rose unpredictably from below. They could suppress. They could not secure. At 16:20, the ground convoy attempted its second push. Elements from the 10th Mountain Division, reinforced with additional Humvees and 5-ton trucks, moved back into the city. Their route had been adjusted based on fragmented reports from the first attempt. It did not matter. The city had already adapted to the first incursion. Roadblocks appeared earlier this time. Fighters anticipated turns. The convoy's lead vehicles took fire within minutes of entering the urban grid. Gunners responded immediately, M2.50 caliber machine guns firing in controlled bursts, Mk-19 grenade launchers sending 40mm rounds into suspected positions. The firepower was overwhelming, but it was applied against absence. Targets appeared for seconds, then dissolved into doorways, into crowds, into structures that could not be engaged. Without escalation beyond the mission's constraints, the convoy slowed, then stopped, then fragmented. Communication between vehicles degraded under stress. Drivers missed turns. One element pushed too far ahead, then had to reverse under fire. Another unit halted to recover wounded, creating a gap that exposed the rest of the column. Every adjustment created another vulnerability. Back at the first crash site, Delta's internal clock was running out. The wounded crew were partially extracted from the wreckage, but evacuation required vehicles or aircraft that could land. Neither was available. The perimeter tightened, not because they were losing ground, because there was no more ground to hold. At 16:40, the second crash site, Super 64, reached its breaking point. Master Sergeant Gary Gordon and Sergeant First Class Randy Sugart had been on the ground for less than 20 minutes. They had inserted by MH6 under direct risk, fully aware of the isolation. Their equipment was minimal for what they were facing. CAR-15 rifles, limited ammunition, no heavy weapons, no reinforced perimeter. Just position and intent. The pilot, Michael Durant, was still alive inside the wreckage when they arrived. They pulled him from the aircraft, moved him to what cover they could find, and established a defensive arc. There was no outer ring, no relief force, only proximity. The militia closed in from every direction, not in coordinated formations, but in density. Close enough that distinguishing individual threats became secondary to maintaining a continuous field of fire. Gordon and Sugart did not maneuver. They anchored. They fired in controlled sequences, shifting angles, conserving ammunition where possible, extending the time between engagements by seconds that felt longer than they were. They requested reinforcement once. They already knew the answer. Back at the Tactical Operations Center, the situation was no longer being tracked as a mission. It was being managed as multiple simultaneous emergencies. The chain of command began to compress under the weight of requests. Ground elements called for extraction. Air units requested clearer rules of engagement. Convoy commanders asked for updated routes that no longer existed in a stable form. Approvals lagged. Not from indecision. From overload. Each decision required context. Context no longer held. As daylight began to fade, the environment shifted again. Shadows lengthened between buildings. Identification became harder. Night vision equipment gave U.S. forces an advantage, but only in spaces where lines of sight could be maintained. Mogadishu did not offer many of those. At 1710, the perimeter at Super 64 was overrun. Gordon was hit first. Sugart continued firing, repositioning slightly, maintaining coverage over Durant until he no longer could. Their final transmission had already been sent. There was no follow-up. The crash site fell silent in a way that only meant one thing. At Super 61, the situation held, but just barely. Ranger units had formed a tight defensive structure around the crash, integrating with Delta operators. Casualties mounted. Ammunition was redistributed manually, magazine to magazine, man to man. Water was gone. Some had been fighting for over 2 hours without pause. The convoy was still not there. When it finally approached, it did not arrive as a coherent force. It emerged in fragments. Vehicles damaged. Crews disoriented. Routes improvised. But it was enough. Just enough to begin extraction. Loading the wounded took time they did not have. Each movement exposed them again. Each delay drew more fire. But they moved anyway, prioritizing those who could not move themselves. The dead were left where they fell. Not by decision. By necessity. As the convoy pulled back, it did not exit cleanly. It fought its way out the same way it had entered. Through a city that no longer behaved like terrain, but like pressure. By the time the last elements reached the Pakistani stadium, it was night. Not the kind that brings silence. The kind that confirms what the day already decided. They had gone in to capture 2 men. They left with something else entirely. Not a victory. Not a defeat that could be measured in territory. But a realization that the operation had been executed exactly as designed. And that was the problem. By the time the convoy reached the Pakistani stadium, the system had already begun rewriting the outcome. Not publicly. Internally. Casualty counts were confirmed first. 18 American soldiers killed. Dozens wounded. Aircraft losses documented. Equipment accounted for where possible, abandoned where necessary. The 2 lieutenants they had captured at the beginning of the operation were still in custody. That detail remained intact. Everything else had shifted. Inside the stadium perimeter, Malaysian Condor armored personnel carriers and Pakistani M48 tanks formed a defensive shell. Floodlights cut through the darkness. Illuminating vehicles returning in fragments. Bullet-scarred Humvees, trucks missing panels, men covered in dust that had settled into sweat and blood. Medical teams moved immediately. Triage zones were established on concrete floors. Tourniquets replaced in controlled conditions. For lines inserted where dehydration had already complicated blood loss. Some wounds had gone untreated for hours. Others had been managed in motion, inside vehicles that never stopped long enough for stability. There was no noise of panic. Only compression. Orders given in low voices. Movements precise. No one asked what had happened. They already knew enough. Michael Durant was not among them. His absence was noted, logged, passed up the chain. Confirmation would come later. Captured. Alive. At the Tactical Operations Center, reporting began before recovery was complete. Situation summaries moved upward through Joint Special Operations Command channels. From there to U.S. Central Command. Then to Washington. Each layer required clarity. Clarity did not exist yet. So the reports focused on what could be confirmed. 2 helicopters down. Recovery operations executed. Personnel extracted under hostile conditions. Enemy resistance described as heavier than anticipated. The language remained controlled. It had to, because the system does not describe failure in the moment it is still processing it. On the ground, operators began to reconstruct their own version of events. Not formally, through fragments. A ranger squad comparing positions, realizing how close they had been to the convoy without ever seeing it. Delta operators recounting the timeline at the crash site, measuring decisions in seconds that no longer aligned with official reports. Pilots from the 160th SOAR debriefed separately, mapping flight paths, identifying where visual confirmation had failed, where fire had come from angles they could not anticipate. Each piece was accurate. None of them fit together cleanly. Because the operation had not failed in a single place. It had failed everywhere at once. The chain of command began to compress the narrative into something usable. Requests for armored support had been delayed due to coordination with UN forces. Convoy navigation had been complicated by unfamiliar terrain. Enemy forces had demonstrated unexpected levels of coordination. All true, none sufficient. Because the mission had not collapsed due to a lack of resources. It had collapsed under the weight of its own assumptions. That part did not appear in the reports. Instead, the focus shifted to recovery. Within days, additional U.S. forces were deployed to stabilize the situation. Armor was introduced in greater numbers. Operational posture adjusted. Movement became more cautious, more deliberate. The tempo dropped. Not by choice, by consequence. And then, just as quickly as it had escalated, the presence began to withdraw. Political pressure moved faster than military adaptation. The cost had become visible, not in strategic terms, in images, in footage that carried the weight of something the system could not contain. So the mission changed again, not on the ground. Above it, orders were issued. Timelines accelerated. Forces redeployed. By March 1994, U.S. troops were gone. The city remained unsecured, unresolved. The lieutenants captured on October 3rd had not altered the balance of power in Mogadishu. Aidid's network adapted, redistributed, continued. The objective had been achieved. The outcome had not. Inside the system, the operation was categorized, analyzed, archived. Lessons identified. Procedures reviewed. Adjustments recommended. But none of those processes changed what had already been exposed. That the most capable units, operating with precision, supported by intelligence and air power, had entered an environment they did not understand. And the environment had responded accordingly. Not with superiority, with inevitability. What changed was not immediate. There was no moment where the system stopped and acknowledged what had happened. It continued. It analyzed. It documented. And then, slowly, it adjusted. But the adjustment did not begin with tactics. It began with doubt. Inside Joint Special Operations Command, the after-action reviews did not focus on marksmanship or insertion timing or even convoy coordination. Those had all been executed within acceptable margins. The discomfort came from something less measurable. Why did control disappear so quickly? Why did the environment respond faster than the plan could adapt? The answers did not sit inside traditional metrics. They sat inside assumptions. For years after Mogadishu, U.S. Special Operations doctrine began to shift in ways that were not publicly visible. Not dramatic, not announced, just quieter. Task force structures evolved. Intelligence integration deepened. The role of units like the CIA's Special Activities Division expanded, not as a supporting element, but as a shaping force. Before operations even began, human intelligence networks were no longer optional. They became primary. Because Mogadishu had exposed something that satellite imagery and signals interception could not provide. Intent at scale. This is where the transformation took hold. In later theaters, Afghanistan, Iraq, the approach began to change. Not immediately, not completely, but enough to be noticed by those inside the system. JSOC operations started to stretch beyond single-night raids. Targeting cycles became continuous rather than episodic. Surveillance was no longer measured in hours or days, but in patterns that extended across weeks. Units like Delta Force still executed direct action missions. But those missions were no longer the beginning of the operation. They were the end of a longer process. A process that attempted, at least in part, to understand the environment before forcing it to react. Even the integration of air assets changed. Unmanned aerial systems, Predator drones, did not replace helicopters. They replaced uncertainty. Persistent surveillance allowed operators to watch, not just strike. To observe behavior over time. To identify when a target was alone, when movement patterns shifted, when intervention would create the least disruption. It was not about overwhelming force anymore. It was about timing. But the deeper change was more subtle. It was psychological. Mogadishu had forced a recognition that speed, by itself, creates visibility. And visibility creates reaction. So the most effective operations became the ones that delayed that reaction for as long as possible. Sometimes indefinitely. This is why, years later, some of the most successful missions were the ones no one saw. No helicopters circling overhead. No convoys pushing through streets. No firefights lasting through the night. Just absence. A target removed from the system without triggering it. That did not happen because the units became stronger. They were already strong. It happened because they stopped assuming that strength was the answer. The institutional memory of Mogadishu remained, even when it was not referenced directly. Operators who had been there carried it into training, into planning, into the way they evaluated risk. They understood something that could not be written cleanly into doctrine. That control is not established when you arrive. It is negotiated long before that. And if you arrive too visibly, the negotiation is already over. The Battle of Mogadishu did not redefine warfare. It clarified it. It showed, with precision, the gap between capability and understanding, between executing a mission correctly and choosing the right mission to execute. Because everything on October 3rd had worked the way it was designed to work. The helicopters inserted on time. The target building was secured. The lieutenants were captured. Every component performed. And still, the system failed. Not because it was weak, because it was certain. Certain that speed would prevent resistance. Certain that intelligence had captured the full picture. Certain that the environment would behave within the boundaries it understood. It had everything, and it still couldn't see it. What Mogadishu revealed was not a flaw in execution. It revealed a blind spot, one that only becomes visible when the system is under pressure. And by the time it becomes visible, it is already too late to correct in real time. So the correction happens afterward, quietly, slowly, in the way operations are planned, in the questions that are asked before movement begins, in the hesitation that did not exist before. Not hesitation as weakness, but as awareness. Because the most dangerous moment in any operation is not when things go wrong. It is when everything appears to be working. That is when assumptions go unchallenged. That is when patterns repeat without examination. That is when the system stops looking for what it cannot see. Mogadishu forced it to look again, not at the enemy, at itself. And once you see that kind of failure clearly, you do not remove it. You carry it. You build around it. You learn to operate with it in mind. Because the environment will always be more complex than the plan. And the moment you believe otherwise, you are already inside the collapse.